Dave's in the studio. All right, guys, thanks a lot. I have the benefit of speaking after dinner, the misfortune of speaking after the two previous speakers who dispensed all of this wisdom. And now I'm going to come up here and tell you what we can learn from cringe content creators online. This is something of a new experience for me. I've given lots of conference talks at places. I've even given one in Nashville, but never on politics. And so this is kind of a unique experience. When I was in college, I remember that one of my friends, the first time I went to a conference, told me that there were two things that any conference talk that was really fantastic had to have. The first thing was that the speaker be personable enough, perhaps telling a joke. And the second thing, and this really stuck with me, was that the conference talk would have to answer one question. Not just any question, but one singular question that all conference audiences, whether they came to hear about physics or politics or My Little Pony, wanted to have answered. They needed to have this question answered, at least implicitly. Now, I tried to write a joke at the beginning of this thing, something about breaking a leg, maybe, I don't know. But at this point, my humor is just thoroughly dad humor, and I didn't want to subject you to that. So I got to thinking, what happens if I just ask the big question? And, I just open with the big question that all conference talks have to implicitly answer right off the bat. I tried this. Way too intense. I felt like I was General Patton and I'd have some kind of nationalist flag up here. I promise that's not what the screen is for, right? So I split the difference, and I'm going to here talk about a very silly question, hopefully building towards something more serious. And the question I wanted to answer today, the question that people ask me again and again with irritation is, Dave, why do you watch BreadTube? First, an introduction for those people who are blessed enough not to be online. BreadTube is a portmanteau referencing Peter Kropotkin's anarchist manifesto, The Conquest of Bread. It's a shorthand for a type of left-wing YouTube video that became popular after 2017, and that I started watching after 2018 rather avidly. And I describe this as a vice, and that's because anyone who has even a passing understanding or knowledge of this genre understands that BreadTube is just trash tier political content. You can't get any lower. I mean, it really has no substance. The first thing you notice about BreadTube, and I'm going to keep this brief, really. I'm not here to bash BreadTube, I promise. Well, kind of. It's not exactly an idea space. When it's not consumed by Twitter drama, the latest cancellation campaign, its big luminaries, Natalie Wynn from ContraPoints, Thought Slime, Zero Books, or the streamer Vosh, don't really have much in the way on a handle of their ideology. They call themselves anarchists or leftists, and it's never very clear what that means. Admittedly, in the very early day of BreadTube, there was ideology, but very slowly the whole genre became consumed in the practice of edutainment, which is pox inflicted by Jon Stewart, I think. And now they spend most of their time complaining about normicons, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, the ever-present threat of Republicans, and how capitalism caused everything in the world to be wrong. That is, of course, when they're not using their YouTube earnings to buy Porsches and mansions in Beverly Hills. So perhaps this is obviously a common fate for online spaces. The focus on initial subject matter slowly dissipates and people become invested in the personalities of the YouTube stars and their mental illnesses. But I find this interesting because even in this dimension, BreadTube is unique. Because as with something like Gamergate, when it shattered into 1,000 different directions. There's no end of the different directions people went after that explosion. But in BreadTube, all of the styles became increasingly indistinct and not discernible from each other. There's this common phenomenon where all streamers are now starting to look more and more and more like the original vampire Debate Me Bro Destiny. And of course you have that well-known phenomenon where the formerly interesting and somewhat educational philosophy tube literally morphed into a copy of ContraPoints, physically and content-wise. Not necessarily because we could debate how much personal choice was it, but more because I think there was just a Natalie Wynn-shaped hole in the YouTube search algorithm, and perhaps the Patreon mill. But with this said, as much as I want to bash them, as bad as the content is, I need to answer the question that my wife asks me every day when she catches me watching this stuff. She says, David, if you hate this stuff so much, if it makes you so angry, why do you keep on watching it? Well, okay, it's complicated. That's the answer, right? You're not here to hear that. So there's the basic facts of the matter, and this is, I think, true for a lot of us, right? Leftism has played a role in why we're here today. That's mainly the reason why most of us have reached the positions we are right now. I hate to admit it too, but we can't divorce ourselves from our own negative reactions to things. For myself, my journey away from left-wing ideas wasn't at all straightforward. The height of my progressivism, the year I voted for Barack Obama, 2008, was also the year I gave up on atheism and began my journey back to religion. But I can't describe my own process of thought without describing the left. And when I look at where I am now, I am always curious as how I stand to what I left behind, relative to what I left behind. So I was born and grew up in Northern California, not at the heart of San Francisco and the Bay Area, but close enough so that its sort of cultural background radiation just infused everything that was around us. And I think for one, very few outsiders really understand the Golden State. They see it simply as a cultural force, an epicenter of progressivism, a blob of deracinated protoplasm that touches things and assimilates them and makes it look more like just the nothingness it has become right now. But once upon a time, when I was a kid, when I was a child there, it was a very, very particular state with its own history, its own promises, its own visions for the future. Even looking back in the 1990s, my friends and I had a very different understanding of ourselves and our future. We had a constant community and a sense of history, and people understood that this would always be the case. It was a sentiment that I don't think people commonly associate with West Coast states, and obviously it was a very different vision than I think our leaders ultimately chose. For a dissident from the progressive vision that California did eventually embrace in full, my own journey has been quite strange. I went in one direction. My home state, along with almost all of my friends, went in an entirely different one. At first, it was easy to believe that this change was entirely superficial. It was just politics after all. But slowly, alienation grew. This was, of course, no age for friendships across political divides. Now, people from blue states will know this routine. Leftists are ever willing to terminate friendships for ideological reasons. And so if you're friends with one, you do a lot of sitting, nodding, and biting your tongue, hoping all the while they're not going to ask you the right question that will force you to reveal your power level. But perhaps the most surreal experience I ever had in one of these situations where I was nodding was in 2017, when an old friend of mine, one of my best friends, started waxing poetic about the brilliance, the eloquence, the genius of ContraPoints. Spiel probably lasted for 30 seconds, and I could feel my tongue hanging like the sword of Damocles in my mouth, waiting to sever the neck of my friendship with this old friend. And, I mean, come on, really? ContraPoints? The brilliant luminary of our age, the savior of the millennial generation. I debated ContraPoints 6 months before this conversation. 5 days before, I did a video criticizing, mocking the very video essay they were now treating like it was some glorious merger between Stanley Kubrick, Bertrand Russell, and RuPaul's Drag Race. I remember leaving the conversation godsmacked at how far of us each of us traveled in opposite directions. Had it really been that long since college? Sorry guys, I have to find my place. Okay, but sometime later, I mentioned this growing alienation to my mother, who then told me something very profound, although I don't think she meant it to be profound at the time. And she said to me, David, you always need to remember that as much as you and your friends disagree about politics, you all want the same things. You're all working for the same beautiful future. And well, we're laughing, but I mean, this I think is profound. There's a lot of wisdom here, if not boomerish. But I found myself asking genuinely, is this actually true? Did we want the same thing? Were we all circling back towards the common end of history? To be fair, as a progressive in my youth, and even more recently, this insight couldn't be too far off. My past self certainly wasn't dreaming a subjugated humanity smashed flat in the name of equity. In fact, back in the day, progressivism itself had a kind of vocious charm to it. Hell, the culture of the 60s was drenched in that charm. That was the charm of Haight Ashbury of San Francisco. All of the cultural elements of 1990s California were touched by that. I liked Birkenstocks and hemp clothing and the movie Easy Rider. And at the risk of getting kicked out of this conference, I'll confess here that still to this day, the Grateful Dead are one of my favorite bands. Is that a controversial opinion? I think they're good. But was the modern left really the same? We are a long way from the days of Jefferson Airplane. The only surviving text from that era, I think that has any relevance and that's quoted by modern progressives, is John Lennon's Imagine, which for all of its idealism is simply a long list of things that won't exist after the revolution, which is to say doesn't have much of an imagination. And yes, that's the dad humor that I spared you from the beginning. What was the left's positive vision for humanity? What was the future that they yearned for? What was their aesthetic? Where were their luminaries leading them? And these questions brought me back to the source, to the internet, to BreadTube, to the content creators that my progressive friends applauded and enjoyed. This is perhaps a roundabout way of getting at the issue that might have been solved by a more brave conversation, but given how many friendships I've already lost, this was my best attempt. So this became the reason why I watched BreadTube. I was looking for something. I wanted to understand the new leftist dream. I wanted to know what strange country the progressive rabbit hole led to. And was it the same country I was traveling to? Again, the question was difficult. The qualities of left-wing texts generally are that they avoid any kind of substantive plans and instead prefer critique, absolute critique if you prefer. I suppose this isn't uncommon for YouTubers, and I can't criticize this tendency since I still to this day have never made a video on distributism. Still, I think that the media people consume is a good place to look for their aspirations. And I started at first with aesthetics, the look they presented. Now, I think this does work on a lot of other political movements. After all, aesthetics contain an aspirational dimension to them. You see what people want in the future. You can imagine the future that they're presenting. You can't divorce tie-dyed shirts and bandanas from the free love movement, and just think of what synthwave was to the 2017 alt-right, kind of encapsulated what they want. Aesthetics implicitly impugns an attitude, and the choices say a lot. But did this really hold true for the modern left? For BreadTube at least, irony culture had done its work. So little of its aesthetics were inspirational or aspirational. So much was simply a reflection of the world that each one wanted to abolish, be they the Rococo set designs of ContraPoints, the 1950s documentarian vibe of Zero Books, and the 1990s cartoon consumerism of Thought Slime. Based on this image alone, you would assume progressive aspirations were entirely negative. But maybe it wasn't altogether negative. Some more pieces started falling into place when I noticed one night Natalie Wynn, in the absolute dearth of ordinary content, was streaming playthroughs of a dating simulator set in 18th century France. 18th century France, the Ancien regime, the height of all things white, imperialistic, and reactionary. Now, a satirical set design might be one thing, but why is the queen of BreadTube play acting a French noblewoman in the same way that Marie Antoinette play acted a French shepherdess? It somehow seemed revealing. And conservatives have often remarked that leftists, for all their professed revolutionary zeal, are typically obsessed with fictional universes that are anything but revolutionary. Think J.R.R. Tolkien, beloved by leftists, whose politics seem to have fallen somewhere between Joseph de Maistre and Theodore Kaczynski. Or rather, Harry Potter, who, although purportedly written by a progressive author, although I don't know if she has her creds still, which depicts, obviously, a very traditionalist British boarding school. And I probably don't need to mention the ethno-nationalism of something like a Black Panther. It's tempting to imagine that behind the eyes of every leftist there's a closeted reactionary, but just based on this evidence alone, it's not accurate. All of these right-wing settings were narrative constructs or game environments, and nothing about them was aspirational. And I think we on the right can understand this a little bit, right? Certainly, one of the most popular settings that right-wingers talk about, at least online, is a setting of Warhammer. But I don't think that we really want to be in a universe of despotism where heretical aliens and mutants are trying to destroy humanity in the name of demonic gods, although maybe we do live in that universe. It's just a framing mechanism. Gothic settings, based on their qualities, make reactionary virtues seem more prominent. And in order to have prominently featured progressive virtues, you need to have a traditionalist setting. Harry Potter just can't be a hero unless he's bucking against the stodgy strictures of a traditionalist boarding school and competing with a pseudo-fascist Lucius Malfoy. When leftists gravitate towards these images, they're gravitating towards them as narrative tools. And no one is saying, this is the world that I want to live in, unless they finally did say, this is the world I want to live in. Sometime in late December, a video dropped on YouTube. Not just any video, but the video. The one that showed the future, the science fiction destiny of the progressive vision for humanity in all its aesthetic and moral glory. And at once, almost every left-wing Twitter account I could see, and admittedly, I stuck my hands in the cookie jar and looked at Twitter. But only because it came up on Telegram, I promise. And it was universal. You'd have thousands of tweets looking at this video, and they would say things like, this is the solar punk future I'm fighting for. This is the vision we all want. What I wouldn't give to live here. And of course, that's music to my own ears. It answers the question. And the accounts that were echoing this applause, these weren't boomer hippies. These were the Zoomer, the millennials that watched BreadTube. Had it finally happened? Had the left discarded its cynicism to tell the world what they actually wanted? Maybe, but since this is a multimedia presentation, at this point we're going to watch this. But this is important. I think this is important. I mean, this is powerful stuff, right? I mean, I'm a black-hearted reactionary, and I wouldn't mind living in this world. I think the Hayao Miyazaki animation really does sell us on the beauty of the world, its groundedness, the deep connections each of the characters have to the land and to each other. It's truly superb, and you're probably thinking that some crack team of anarchist animators spent day and night putting this little 1-minute clip together. Well, not quite. This is actually a corporate ad for yogurt. Shivani specific. It's edited so you can't see that, right? But indeed it is. Yes, in case you didn't notice that last shot, and I don't know if it made it into this one or not, but it seems that if you look at the refrigerator, the only thing that the denizens of this utopia eat that isn't pried whole from the bosom of Mother Earth are Chobani corporate products with their brand name quickly visible. And of course, we're laughing, and a lot of conservatives, pretty much everyone on the right, was all abuzz with the hypocrisy line as usual. But they seem to miss the real power of this. The left was being honest. They were telling us what they wanted. They were giving us a positive vision of the future, and this is nothing if not a learning experience. So why not look closer? Perhaps you're probably saying where I'm going with this. But my first reaction to seeing this and trying to take it in earnestly is to kind of squint at it might this solar punk future of pastoral human farmers be a little bit reactionary, dare I say? I think it was LP from the I Hypocrite channel who pointed this out first. But why does the left-wing vision of utopia look so much like Amish life with more robots? And in fact, what makes this a left-wing vision altogether? Why do we know it's leftist? It's hard to say. The adjectives we might associate with this vision would be cozy, grounded, and human, words we don't often associate with the modern left. And despite the fact that this is called solar punk, there's nothing punk about it. The only elements that make this vision left-wing are certain details which also contain strange ambiguities. Now here we need to be fair. This isn't an engineering plan for the future, and it's inappropriate to dissect its technical feasibility. Nevertheless, there are narrative contradictions, aesthetic contradictions that reveal things about what makes this text attractive and what makes it leftist. And it seems for every answer or any unanswered question on screen, if one were to fill in the details, the community depicted would get a lot less cozy, a lot less real, or a lot less left-wing. Take, for instance, the space-age technology designed to look sustainable. Now, anyone here with a physics background would know that there's no way a flying school bus is going to use less energy than a normal school bus. And it's very unlikely that thousands of little robotic harvesters are going to be more efficient than a large harvester with a limited range of motion. I mean, also we could point out, is it really more green now that we're using artificial clouds to water plants as opposed to sprinkler systems? And were robotic scarecrows really a necessary step on our path to a low-energy future? But if one were to modify the scenario, replacing the space-age technology with modern technology, or perhaps worse yet, with 19th century farming equipment like plows and oxen, immediately we've transformed a left-wing vision into Middle America, or worse yet, the Amish. Now the vision is fundamentally out of sync with what any person on BreadTube would want. A similar incongruity exists on the question of family life. The video is sure to focus on this, the relationships, long-lasting intergenerational bonds. It's clear that the child depicted has a stable home life. A mother, perhaps not a father, I should say, but maybe in this universe, children draw more stability from solar panels than they do from a two-parent home, so who knows? But how far does this actually go? Do the adults in this community fully participate in the polymorphous perversity of our own age? Once the sun goes down on this pastoral paradise, does everyone in this community log into Pornhub, OnlyFans, and Tinder? Do the children of this community have to deal with their parents taking on a new sexual partner day in and day out? A new set of adult peers every week? It's more leftist to be sure, but it's also a lot less cozy. And now I also have to mention the elephant in the room, race. Not really my thing, but here it goes. Everyone knows that a big part of this reason why this thing is leftist is race, because if it had depicted white skin, braids, square jaws, and dirndls, it would immediately go from being a wet dream of leftists to being Nazi propaganda. Luckily, we're treated to a very, very diverse community, but there are problems. For those who understand genetics, wouldn't a deeply intergenerational community with no barriers to reproduction become a little bit more genetically normalized? Wouldn't the people of this community start looking like their own distinct ethnicity and less like a photo op from the United Colors of Benetton? I suppose people from the 90s get that. I suppose immigration could be one explanation. Perhaps a more progressive explanation might be in this futuristic universe. Adults choose their race just as modern progressives choose their gender and are subsequently surgically altered to look the part. What we're seeing in this depicted utopia is less the emergence of a new ethnicity and more just a bunch of individual fashion choices which happen to correspond to the preferences of Chobani Incorporated's Human Resources Department. So for a few days I toyed with this problem. How could I come up... For a few days I toyed with this problem, trying to fill in the details of this utopia, but it never seemed to be right. No matter how much technological explanation I added in, what resulted from any speculation was either not properly real or not properly left-wing. And then a very obvious revelation hit me. If this world were real, it simply could not be leftist by definition. There were no circumstances of fact that could make a left-winger want to live in this space. Because even if this world of pansexual, post-racial peasants could be built, it would immediately be deconstructed by the very progressives who demanded it exist in the first place. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that the left's desire is insincere. It's not that I think that the left doesn't want to experience this vision. They genuinely want to have this future, just as I think Giovanni Incorporated genuinely wants to build it for them. But we make a mistake in assuming what they want from this future. Because the world of the video we just saw was not designed to be lived in. It was designed to be simulated. And here I think we might have the answer. The motivating aesthetic for the left, the modern left, the key to their future is unreality. The left prefers worlds that cannot exist because any world that does exist would have limitations that would constrain an individual's will. As such, the second any future vision is modified to look plausible, it becomes alien to the left's desires. Modern progressives want a world with no constraints, and since lived reality has constraints, such an ideal world could never exist. But here, of course, I say this ideal world could never exist only in the lucid sense, because this vision of the world will certainly exist as an element of virtual reality, as a cell in Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse, a never-ending video game where users have their narcissistic fantasies realized at the behest of elites too eager to exile surplus youth to a virtual reality prison. This is the ultimate draw of unreality, something that we know well from pornography. Reality is intense, high cost, and has consequences. You can't just walk away from it. Pornography is easy, has no costs, but the results slowly alienate you from anything that's real. Yet this pornographic element of all aesthetics seems so intrinsically linked to the world that the left now strives for. What remains of leftism today seems less like a harbinger for a new world and more like a nemesis to an existing one, a doppelganger ever attempting to destroy the original for fear that it will shown to be fake. Can the simulation be just as good as reality? We better remove the alternative just to be sure. After all, once reality is destroyed, maybe pornography will be the truest version of sexual experience. Maybe Natalie Wynn's simulated 18th century France will be the truest account of European tradition. And maybe Giovanni's corporate propaganda will be the most magnificent worldview into human potential. Only in illusion can the desires of narcissists truly be sated. And what will remain after all of this has been completed will only be toy worlds inhabited with toy humans designed to aggrandize the ego of the consumer, ruling over them like a toy god. Really, this is the heart of my alienation from the leftism that I left, my separation from the politics of my youth. If I were to speak to my progressive friends from the heart, if I were to boil all of my objections to their absolute most basic form, I would simply say this: I have no desire to be a toy person, let alone a toy god. And this is the only thing progressivism has ever offered me. I suppose at this stage, I am now finishing my discussion on BreadTube, and I'm ready to make the big transition and ask the real question. The one big question that all conference talks, at any conference, always implicitly try to answer, but never really state. The question is, why are we here? Why are we here? Why did I, why did you, why did any of us take time out of our day, money out of our constrained wallets, to travel great distances to be here to talk to each other? What did we hope to accomplish? What did we hope to say or to hear? What did we hope to give towards the greater good? In all honesty, having asked this question, I can't answer it for you. Everyone will have their own reasons for being here, and most of the time, if this conference is really good, you'll find the real reason for being here in the place you least expected it. But because I have brought up the question, let me tell you my own reasons for being here for what it's worth. Now, in some superficial sense, I'm here because people asked me to give a talk. But on a deeper level, I'm really here not so much to talk as to listen. We're entering a new and amazingly chaotic age, sooner than I ever thought we would. And I have questions. I have questions I think we can answer together. The theme of this conference is navigating the ruins. This is a timely subject. In the past, there might have been a question about the decline of society, whether it really was a crisis or not, and how fast, of course, it was happening. But now, for better or for worse, the issue is very much framed for all of us to see. And we're simply trying to find the right response to it, trying to find the right way to survive the ending of the old world and the beginning of something else. Of course, there are many different learnings that need to be taken on board at these times, but for myself, the most critical issue is how we properly confront the spirit of the age and find a proper dialectic vision. Now here I am borrowing or stealing words from German idealists like Hegel with the concept of dialectic and zeitgeist. This is a school of philosophy I make no pretension to understand, although I have tried many times in the past. Still, I think this language reflects a key piece of perennial folk wisdom. In every age, in every generation, there is a spirit of the moment and a set of questions that it imposes, which must be answered. In this context, whatever our beliefs, passions, or vocations, our collective response to this central set of historical questions will define the legacy of the era and define our legacy as people. This is what creates a type of historical dialectic, a collective conversation we participate in, not simply through our political discourse, but more importantly, with how we conduct our lives, build our communities, and orient our values. In any given period, humanity is given a challenge, not simply to understand the world, but to make sure that their efforts are well directed towards the questions that really matter. When there is a failure to understand this dialectic, or more frequently, a failure to face its implications, tragedy occurs. In this sense, I think my own generation, the millennials, have experienced a number of these dialectic tragedies. I remember distinctly participating in two of them. The first was the New Atheist movement and its merciless attack on faith. I remember participating in this conflict, ironically enough on both sides, the endless debates over apologetics, so much raw talent and effort, and yet so little good produced. Not that the question of God has no value, it has in fact infinite value. The problem was that the question posed by the New Atheists was a false one, because it didn't actually reflect what people were asking themselves in the late 2000s. No one in the audience of the God debates was genuinely asking themselves about metaphysics. Instead, what they were really asking themselves was this: do we as modern people, with all of our technology, have the right to look down on all of generations of past humans? Does our science give us license to despise all past luminaries? Can't we deconstruct what our ancestors have built? And does the falsehood of religion demonstrate this? Of course, most of my generation already had an answer chosen, and so the debate came to a conclusion predictably and tragically. I say tragically because so few of the intellectuals involved understood what they were doing. The liberal secularists had convinced themselves they were saving the Enlightenment from religious fundamentalism. Instead, they are acting as the midwives to a godless religious fury that is now on the verge of ending the Enlightenment once and for all. Which, come to think of it, might be a good thing, but still has sort of great tragedy. Online reaction to this great awakening, post-Gamergate, I think a similar mistake was made. This was the time of the edgy meme, the response video, and the SJW takedown. A surge of counter-progressive thought spawned 1,000 YouTube channels, one of them being my own. But what did it ultimately achieve? Granted, unlike the New Atheists, the post-Gamergate right wing understood that the enemy was in part the tireless political deconstruction of authentic human experience. Very few luminaries in the movement had a good understanding of how far down the problem went and what an honest answer would entail. And history dealt the followers of this path a harsh lesson indeed. It turns out that you can't actually use the tools of the enemy to win. Clout chasing, popularity on social media platforms, slacktivism, and the adulation of disconnected millennial consumers won't get you anywhere. And a culture based on memes, edginess, and irony is poisonous to the soul. None of these strategies could ever have worked, and anyone who leaned on one of these pillars, including in part myself, was chastised for their efforts. Today, speaking at the beginning of the year of our Lord 2022, I believe another one of these false dialectics is falling away. The dialectic of left versus right. Now once more, left and right are still salient categories intellectually. I still believe right-wing views are correct. I still believe left-wing views are wrong. But this itself does not make the question of left versus right the relevant one to our primary struggle we are fighting in the context of the spirit of the age. Karl Marx and Michel Foucault are very much wrong, but Karl Marx and Michel Foucault are also very much dead, and their dreams of an emancipated secular humanity are very much dead with them. What we're asking ourselves now is not whether mankind should live by left-wing ideals, but rather whether mankind should be entombed with those ideals in memory. And in understanding this point, the flaws of BreadTube become an important object lesson. As far as the modern world goes, there is no left remaining. At one stage, there was a genuine leftist dream, but at some point it ran into reality and its followers sacrificed it on the altars of cynical politics and personal narcissism. And so we have the modern progressive movement as it exists today. Now, I don't mean to imply that there are no sincere leftists. There are many, and I know them. But I am saying here that there are no undeceived ones. Because anyone with their eyes open knows now that modern leftism promises nothing but fantasy, self-gratification, and chaos. And those who follow it consciously are either hoping to cynically benefit from humanity's decline or are willful victims of their own fantasy. And gradually, many people are realizing that there really only is one essential question remaining in our time. The question is not atheist versus theist, woke versus edgelord, or even right versus left, but rather whether humanity itself will prevail as an actual living organism or be consigned to degeneration, virtual sedation, and oblivion. The choice is not between religious man and Marxist man, but rather between man and last man, or if you prefer the internet neologism, man and bug man. We need to decide in this moment whether anything authentically human will survive post-modernity. And to this end, all principles must be applied. This is what forms the backbone of Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction. The right answer to this question of the age, all questions of the age, is what gives a sovereign what the Chinese refer to as the mandate of heaven. And a wrong answer to this central question of the age is what removes it. We see the consequences of this question everywhere, in the slow-motion disasters advancing every day, the decline of the human family, the mass deterioration of culture and health, and the disintegration of our economic and political order. Does man want to survive? Can we break the pattern of history and our political order? Can we break from the strictures of a technologically obsessed society? Can we afford not to? Can we keep living like this? This is how right-wing ideas obtain their relevance in the modern age, not from popularity, but from necessity. After all, right-wing principles are, by their definition, hard. They're hard to advocate, and they're harder to live. But we advance these ideas anyway because they are necessary to answer the challenges of our time. We need these principles to state definitively that meaning is greater than pleasure, that human life is worth more than technological simulacrum, and that civilization should be oriented to defend the two most eternal political imperatives, mankind's survival and mankind's relationship with God. The path before us is stark. I don't need to repeat the litany. We all see the writing on the wall. But there is hope, and strangely, a lot of opportunities. First, for those of us on the right, we have an incredible epistemic head start on our opponents. The left today is farcically unaware of its own nature and the nature of the world around it. And this obliviousness is not limited to the activist class. Progressive leaders are honest with themselves about how the world has changed and what they're able to achieve in it. If nothing else, the trucker protest. And for all the soaring apocalyptic rhetoric from our good friends at the World Economic Forum, all of it ultimately just boils down to boomer cope. These are flailing dinosaurs on top of an old order, perched precariously on a system crumbling that no longer makes sense by its own logic. I can sense these days, many people can, not just on the right, that there is a hunger for a new world. You can see it everywhere you look. From populist uprisings like the one in Ottawa this last week, to the pining pessimism of the Zoomer generation, to the constant refrain that modern culture and entertainment are trite and ultimately soulless. People want a dream and not just a fantasy. They want something that can inspire authentic human existence. For almost 100 years now, the progressive movement has had a total monopoly on dreams, on aspirations. And these dreams have now perished. Humanity's choice either remains suicide or something different. And for people who scoff at the meaningfulness of this stark choice, people will choose suicide in want of a vision. We see this every day when we doom scroll through the news. A new dream is needed. Without it, popular protests are just a collection of peasants, easily dispersed. Without it, any new national government is just a transitory power that will be wiped away by the winds of change. Without it, a world of nations and peoples are just interchangeable blobs, demographic groups that can be moved around, working at cross purposes and ready to fall prey to those who are cynical and evil. And this is where I see the importance of us being here tonight. I'm a video essayist. I'm a video essayist, not a YouTuber. Well, I guess I still am on YouTube. I'm a video essayist as a passion project and not as a profession. I enjoy making videos, and I go to great lengths to make sure that they are honest. But something has always seemed dissonant. While I strive to live by my principles, I do live by a double life. And for all my talk of honest discourse, I don't really experience it. It still lives in the miasma of social media, of parasocial relations. And as such, it can never really aspire to be an element of a discourse that really matters. Real conversations, real connections, real friendships. These are the foundations of anything worthwhile men have ever built collectively. In part, I'm here today to deconstruct boundaries, the boundaries I have erected around my own thinking about politics and philosophy. Partially because I appreciate the dangers of not taking this step, a lesson that was taught to me by New Atheism, Gamergate, and of course, RedTube. Partially because I know that any authentic dialectic must be lived before it can be truly human and have true promise. This conference is one such moment where we might grapple with the real questions of our age and discover something new. Of course, I'm not here trying to shift the burden of some massive cultural rebirth onto this conference in particular. I don't think anyone has the true vision of the future in this age, and I'm not even so sure that such a new vision will emerge in my lifespan. As a matter of fact, just pessimistically speaking, I kind of believe that it's going to be the generation that follows ours. But I do think that whatever we do here is part of a larger pattern, a step in a necessary direction, because only a lack of hope stands in the way of humanity and its future thriving, and man was not an animal intended to remain in despondency and despair. I think here we need to give ourselves permission to look higher, to express what we earnestly want for ourselves, for our children, and for our descendants, to be unconstrained by what seems possible in the present political order. How would a future humanity live? What would inspire them? How would they plan for their descendants and honor their ancestors? These are the questions that can be answered now, because as dissident voices, we are capable of more than those mainstream thinkers who still bow before the desiccated husk of the fallen progressive God. We, fully facing the spirit of the age, we, knowing what we love and what we can fight for, we have the power to be radical. And as we discover a vision worthy of humanity's promise, we can in turn perform that great radical action with our own dreams that the left has been manifestly unable to perform for nigh on 2 centuries. We can live them. Thank you very much.